I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for joining us today. We're really excited to talk to you about a project that we've been working on with funding through NIFPI and Timberlink. So just to give you a bit of background on that project. We, as I said, received that funding from National Institute for Forest Products Innovation, and Timberlink also supported us in that. And basically what we did is we used Timberlink's progress to get a science-based target as a case study to validate a methodology in how we can help companies within specifically wood product manufacturing, but also the timber industry more broadly, to get science-aligned carbon reduction targets. And through that work, we have also developed a tool and a set of resources to assist companies in this journey. So all of those resources will be available publicly on the NIFPI website. And just so everybody knows, we are also recording this webinar. If there's any issues with that, please do let us know right now. But we'll make this webinar public so that you can go back to it if you need to, or you could also refer anybody that you think it might be interesting to. This is the first webinar of two. So next week at the same time on Friday, we're hosting the second one. And that one is an in-depth training session on how to use the tool and resources that we've developed to assist your company in getting that science-based target and also understanding their carbon footprint. And I've thrown out a few terms here, and we will define these as we go through this webinar, so hang tight for that. And also just, I guess, a matter of kind of housekeeping in this webinar setting. We do have the chat box, but we also have a separate question and answer capability. So if you want to ask a question in that format, please do ask it in the Q&A box, because we can then kind of track that thread and better answer it versus the chat box. Okay. So just to run you through the agenda today, I'm going to give a bit of background on what science-based targets are. So science-based targets very much underlie all of the work that we've done, and so we want to make sure there's some understanding of what that is before we jump into some of this other material. Then we'll talk about what role wood plays in providing sustainable solutions. What does taking action on climate change look like? And why is it important? And what is the value of taking action? And then we're going to talk through how you can take action and specifically look at some of those tools that we've developed. We'll jump into a couple case studies, and we'll hear from James Anderson at Timberlink on that. And then we'll also chat about where you can find out more information. And lastly, we should have a bit of time for question and answers. So firstly, what are science-based targets? So science-based targets is an initiative made up of a couple partner organizations. So that is CDP, UN Global Compact, World Resources Institute, WWF. And essentially what science-based targets is it's an international body that has created and put forth a methodology through which companies across all industries and across the entire globe can follow that method to ensure that they're setting targets that align, carbon reduction targets that align to the latest climate science. So when I say climate science, what I mean is a 1.5 degree scenario, and you might have heard that coming out of various different sources. So this is coming from the IPCC, and basically what that means is that we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So from a company or organization perspective, what you want to understand is if you're going down the road of carbon reduction targets, how much do you reduce? Is it 20%, 30%? Science-based targets gives you the guidance to try to understand what that reduction needs to be so that you can contribute your sort of piece of the pie to the overall global reduction in carbon emissions. So it's aligning to that 1.5 degree scenario. And science-based targets also has a validation process. And so essentially what you can be ensured through the Science-Based Target Initiative is that you have followed that methodology and your targets do align to that climate science. but it also allows for comparability across companies. So for example, if you're in the timber industry, how do you know what level of ambition your targets are in comparison to somebody in another industry? If you both have targets that align to the climate science and have been validated through a third party, you can be sure that you can be confident that you are targeting a similar ambition, for example. So as you can see from this slide here, Sciencebased Targets has just over 1,000 companies that have joined, and that is a really broad range. So companies of all sizes, and again, that is quite globally dispersed. So we have companies like Walmart, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, down to Edge ourselves. We also have a science-based target. And here in Australia, we recently have Timberlink, who has science-based targets. So I'm just going to pass over to my colleague Jonas, who's our CEO here at Edge Environment, to talk about what role wood plays in providing sustainable solutions.
Thanks, Maisie. So in terms of what role wood plays in providing sustainable solutions, I think there's this can be categorized across a broad range of different benefits, and probably focusing specifically on wood and timber used in construction in this slide here. But as you can see, it's across a wide range of spectra. It's lightweight, it's strong, it allows for faster construction times, it allows for a quiet and safe internal and built environment, as well as being quite forgiving to design and construction errors, etc. The focus of this presentation is on the top two aspects up at the top left corner, in terms of really around the long-term carbon storage in the timber, and the low-embodied carbon alternative as a construction material. And looking at that probably from a slightly different lens than traditionally have been done. This is looking at it from an organizational perspective, whereas a lot of the focus has often been on timber and tracking a specific product through the economy, but this is more around the scope is looking at this from an organizational perspective. So from that organizational view, what does taking action on climate change look like? And to summarize in four consecutive steps on how action typically is taken, the starting point is to understand your carbon footprint, to measure and quantify the whole value chain of carbon emissions that it's within your organizational scope, and indirect emissions upstream and downstream. And as Maisie mentioned, there will be a tool published and discussed next week, which really streamlines and allows for wood processing companies to make this in an efficient way. Step two after that is to set science-based targets, or set targets in general. Understanding your footprint is fine, but it really is around what is a reasonable and expected amount of reductions to be undertaken, and where should those reductions occur, through what activities or initiatives that really makes a material impact and difference in terms of the main emission sources. And also, the science-based target requires companies to look upstream and downstream when the emissions are significant, when they're non-negligible. So it's not enough to just look at your own operations. You really need to look at the supply chain of what your products and services come from, and also downstream in terms of how the products are used, and even tracing it all the way down to what's going to happen to the products that the organization produce at the end of life. And that means that you need to engage with stakeholders, you need to engage with suppliers, with logistics, with distributors, retail, customers, all the way down to resource recovery and waste management. And then to drive change. So we'll talk a little bit about the drivers in a second, but this is an urgent agenda, and it's really important to not just quietly manage your footprint in your own corner, but it's really about engaging and driving change and communicating. So why is this important? Why is carbon and taking action on climate change important? Starting point, if we keep the focus on the built environment, is looking at the often poorly understood contribution of materials to the global carbon footprint and the construction footprint. 11% of global energy-related carbon emission come from material in construction. And if we look at some of the main construction materials, concrete and steel, from a global perspective, each of those make up about 7 to 8% of the global emissions annually, which is obviously something we can't ignore, and we can't meet the internationally agreed targets without looking at materials. And we're all familiar with the much debated and much publicized Paris Agreement, which came into place and was struck in 2015, where the vast majority of countries agreed to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, or ideally 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. And from that, we've seen different professions come together and take action. We've seen the architects declare a climate and biodiversity emergency. We see builders joining. We see engineers declared, and more professions coming together and look specifically at what they can do within their contributions. We see this converging agenda on a large front. So on this slide, a number of symbols, and I'll talk slightly briefly about what they mean. So we have building rating tools such as Green Star and the Living Building Challenge, which is on a voluntary basis driving emission reductions in the built environment. We have the Sustainable Development Goals, which includes goal number 13, which talks specifically around taking action on climate change as part of the agenda of creating the better world that we all want to see. We have the acronym TCFD, which stands for Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which is a mechanism put in place by the G20 economies a couple of years ago, based on the premise that investors need to know and need to understand the climate risk when they invest in organizations. So how are regulatory changes, how's a carbon price mechanism, how are energy prices, changing weather patterns, how's that going to affect organizations and the value and the risk? So this is a standardized framework for organizations to report into. Maisie talked about the Sciencebased Target Initiative, which is also a voluntary instrument which is driving organizations to validating organizations' carbon reduction targets. We see the European Union starting to put up and planning to put up a trade mechanism and a border for high carbon intense products, and which is going to drive international and global supply chains to be more transparent and more proactive around the carbon management. On a product level, we see the Environmental Product Declaration Program in Australasia and internationally, which is driving transparency and comprehensive life cycle reporting on the carbon footprint of products. And Climate Active, which is a government-run program here in Australia, which gives the ability to carbon offset and claim carbon neutrality for products, but also for organizations, events, buildings and precincts, etc. So what's the value of taking action? We've seen some of the drivers in the market and how this is emerging, but what is the value for organizations? And largely talk about the business case for addressing climate change is to be able to meet this demand for low carbon products, which is increasing from a relatively low basis, but it's becoming one of these hot topics where professionals and organizations are looking at how can we source and identify and be confident that we're sourcing and using low carbon products. And as this spreads through the economy, both in Australia and globally, a lot of organizations are looking at how can we reduce emissions, and it's about helping your customers and supporting your customers on their meeting their sustainability objectives, because they are looking at the whole value chain as well, where we all can play a role. And looking at an organization through a carbon footprint lens and setting target, it almost certainly, without exception, brings up opportunities to identify cost savings and innovative ways to drive the organization and the product development forward. It also supports strategic decision making, looking at the longer term horizon around how the market is going to change, how regulation might change in this space, and price signals and trading conditions. Obviously addresses the climate risk within organizations, whether it's a transitional risk in terms of putting pressure on the organization from a regulatory or economic perspective, or whether it's a physical vulnerability perspective. And it also helps understand the company's performance and impact. And most importantly, it's an opportunity in this point in time for a lot of organizations to demonstrate leadership and step up and in terms of transparency. So how can you take action? Hand over to Maisie there.
Yeah, thanks, Jonas. So first of all, we have gone through sort of an overview of how you take action, as Jonas presented in one of the initial slides, those first 4 steps, and I'm just going to detail about what those steps look like a bit more. So the first one is by using a carbon calculator. So that is what we have provided, but that's certainly not the only way to calculate your carbon footprint, but that calculation of your carbon footprint is definitely that first step. And so what you want to do is essentially set a boundary around your emissions. So what's really important is to capture the entirety of your upstream and downstream emissions when you are looking at that. So we have our Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions as defined by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is basically international best practice standard in terms of greenhouse gas accounting, which is calculating carbon footprints. So Scope 1 emissions are your direct on-site emissions. So that's things like fuel use from vehicles owned or any equipment that you have on site, as well as refrigerants and any emissions associated with the burning of fuel, be it wood stock or otherwise. Scope 2 emissions are primarily your purchased electricity. So largely there you're going to be looking at the buildings that you have control over and the electricity that you're purchasing to run those. And then your Scope 3 emissions are basically those upstream and downstream emissions. And I'll go into a bit more detail as to what that looks like specifically within the timber industry. But what you want to consider are the purchasing of any goods or services. So you want to take into account the embodied carbon of those products that you are actually buying and using within your business, both from a sort of operational standpoint, so that's whatever you might be using within your offices, as well as the product. So if you're a wood product manufacturer, that's looking at the embodied carbon of the logs that you are purchasing. And then what's the transport associated with those? You also want to look at the transport of when you sell your products. So not only how it's gotten to you, but how do you then get that product to your customers or to other partners who might be further processing that product. And this is where you also look at things like business travel and employee commuting and others, and we can detail these in more detail, and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is a great reference for that. Those definitely have less of an impact. However, where you're going to see the most emissions is in your Scope 3, but that's largely going to be in areas associated with those purchased goods and how you're then selling them on to consumers and what's happening with that product. And within the resources that we have provided, does set out exactly the data that you need to calculate your footprint and provides that result for you and breaks it down into the categories that you need. So you don't have to know exactly what these categories are. We help you out with that, so you have a clear list of that. So your second step would be to collect that data. So it can be quite a data intensive process. What we have done through our carbon calculator is trying to streamline that data collection. So there's sort of different levels of carbon footprinting that you can go into. And from a first point, what you're really aiming to do is try to understand where the hotspots are, where you really want to focus your efforts in terms of carbon reduction efforts. And so what an initial carbon footprint allows you to do is it allows you to see those hotspots. So the idea is that you might be collecting data from a higher level perspective at this time. However, you want to work up to providing more and more detailed data. And what we do allow in our carbon footprint calculator is the opportunity to provide more specific data or a sort of higher level version of that same data. So you can understand that if you provide the higher level data, your calculated carbon footprint will be less exact or less precise, but it's something to work towards. And then you can later provide that more specific data to try to refine your carbon footprint. And all of that data should be collected in what's called a base year. And so your base year is that year upon which you're going to set a target. So for example, if we were to set a target in terms of 2030, it would be in reference to a base year. So let's say 2018 is a base year. Your target might be something like a 30% reduction in 2030 off a 2018 base year. So that means whatever your emissions were in 2018, it's a 30% reduction off of that, regardless of your growth trajectory. And I'll demonstrate this a bit later when we start talking more about what a science-based target looks like. So all of your data needs to be across that entirety of the base year. And the base year should be the most recent year that has the most accurate and available data representing a typical business year for you. So if you choose 2018, you definitely want that year to not be an anomaly. So you don't want it to have abnormally high sales or abnormally low sales, because that's sort of going to skew what your footprint looks like. Rather, you want it to be very representative of what you would expect a typical year to be. So the last step in that is to basically enter it into that calculator if you're using our calculator, or provide it to a consultancy if that's how you're doing it, whatever way. But what you want to do is when you get those results back, really try to understand where those hotspots are within your carbon footprint so that you can start implementing carbon reduction measures to reduce across those hotspots. So for example, as I mentioned before, in a supply chain, that's where we're really seeing a lot of the emissions, both upstream and downstream in terms of that, much less so than in terms of office waste or business travel, employee commuting and things. So you want to focus on those kind of big pieces of the pie. So this is basically just a screenshot of what some of the results look like when you use the carbon calculator tool that we've provided. Don't expect you to necessarily be able to read these, but it gives you an idea of the amount of detail that you can get out of using this tool. So essentially you have all of your emissions broken down by scope as per the greenhouse gas protocol, and you can use that to inform that hotspot analysis. So this image here is based on the work that we did with Timberlink. And essentially what it is it's outlining Timberlink's carbon footprint or a wood product manufacturer's carbon footprint. So it's a rough guideline as to how that's broken down across the different aspects of their operations. So we have forestry, haulage, and those are sort of your upstream emissions. So in terms of forestry, you're looking at those logs that are purchased. And the arrows that are on the top of each of these circles represent non-biogenic emissions and biogenic emissions. So biogenic emissions are in green, And you only see those on a few of the circles, and that's because it only applies to certain processes. So biogenic carbon is carbon associated with plants. So specifically in this instance, we're looking at these logs. So it's that carbon that's captured and it's stored in those logs until it decomposes and then it's released. And that's in comparison to non-biogenic emissions, and that's the emissions associated with fossil fuels. So that's the difference between those two arrows. And what we really want to pull out here is the difference in scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and how those differ in terms of their magnitude of the entirety of the emissions. So we can see forestry here has a lot of biogenic emissions coming in, and basically over time throughout the process, they are released in different stages, but ultimately not all of it is released. So some of it is going to stay within that wood at the end of its life. And we can see that forestry haulage is our upstream scope 3 emissions. So that's following that orange line on the bottom. Then we get to our sawmill. So that's the processing of the wood product. And that fits into our scope 1 and 2 emissions. So it's essentially the fuel used on site for that, as well as the purchased electricity. And that there is about 10%. And if we go down a couple more, we have the remainder of our scope 1 and 2 emissions, and that's the distribution center, and that's only 3%. So across the entirety of their footprint, you only have about 13% of all carbon emissions captured in scope 1 and 2. So that means there's a huge amount of emissions that are being released associated with that upstream and downstream scope 3 emissions. So as we were talking about earlier, that is really where the hotspot is and where you want to focus. If we move down around this chart, we can move into the downstream scope 3 emissions. So along the bottom there, we have distribution, processing of sold products, use of sold products, and end of life. As you can see from the 53% that's coming out of that processing of sold products, that is where the majority of emissions lie, and that's essentially representing emissions associated with the further processing of sold products. So specifically, if we're talking about the timber industry, that might be if you are selling wood product that goes into making paper, for example, or wood chips or furniture, whatever it is, the emissions that are associated with that further processing into that final material are captured within your scope 3 emissions. And it's really important that you do look into that. As you can see, it's a huge part of the footprint. So use of sold products is essentially the emissions associated with that product once it's been sold on to the customer. So in the instance of timber, you're not seeing very many emissions there, whereas if we're talking about a company that sells iPhones, for example, the emissions associated with every time they charge that product would be captured in that category. So this is a sort of plus for the timber industry because those emissions essentially are held within that product and they're not released at that use phase. The 1% you are seeing there, it's biogenic emissions, and that's associated with things like wood chips that are degrading in their use phase. And then we go on to end of life. And as you can see, these emissions that are captured here are primarily related to landfill. However, you can reduce those emissions if the timber industry focuses more on reuse of materials, and that essentially then eliminates that end-of-life emissions there. Is there anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, there's a question from the audience here, specifically reading it out, looking at the biogenic emissions from the milling process. And the question is if this is from heating, and how do you calculate potential substitution of fossil fuel energy sources if wood waste is used as a source of energy, for example, if it's burned for heating or turned into biofuels. So, well, if you substitute burning wood mass for heat and electricity in the sawmill operation, your non-biogenic emissions would increase quite dramatically. I think there's quite a bit of energy used, and most of it is from using biomass as the energy source. So that would change the balance of the footprint quite dramatically if you were to substitute the biomass burnt there.
Yeah, and if you do make that switch, then essentially what you want to be considering is transitioning from grid electricity to renewables. However, when we're specifically talking about science-based targets, and this is probably getting a bit technical for this webinar, but I'll have a go at it. Basically what it allows is you can account for, in your carbon footprint boundary, biogenic emissions associated with fuel stocks. So in this instance, they essentially negate each other. So when you are purchasing that wood product, so in the forestry instance, the biogenic emissions that are coming in, and then you burn those. So if it's waste that you've burned from purchased wood product, that then is released. That portion of your biogenic emissions it's essentially circular and negating itself. So you have, X amount coming in, you're then burning that and it comes out to zero. So it's essentially negated, and the purpose of that is so that you're not really making that transition and it's hurting you, for example, in terms of what your carbon emissions look like in the end.
One more questions around the products, the processing of sold products. So Adam is wondering if this is the worst case scenario or if this is typical. I suppose it's based on Timberlink's specific profile and the products that they produce.
Yeah, exactly. So it's very dependent on exactly what types of products you are producing. So just to come back to that, so if you are selling products directly to a consumer and you're not selling any product that becomes further processed, then you would have zero emissions in that processing of sold products category. If you were, for example, selling more product to be manufactured into paper, then you would likely see that go up. So it's really just dependent on exactly how your organization is set up and what what products you are putting forth. And potentially, we might be able to hear from Timberlink a bit more on that when we get to that point. So the next step is to develop credible carbon reduction targets. So that's coming back to that science-based target methodology. We've been talking a lot about the Science-Based Targets initiative, but by no means does it have to be through that initiative. That's just a great way to have it validated by a third-party source. What we're recommending is that it just aligns to the climate science. So that's that 1.5 degree pathway. And in our tool, we've basically created that mechanism for you to calculate your carbon footprint and then set the level of ambition. So do you want to align to that 1.5 degree pathway? And it then provides you with information on what the targets would look like for your company specifically. So it's specific to the base year and the target year that you choose and the quantity of emissions that have been calculated as associated with your company or organization. If you want to go through the specific Science-Based Targets initiative route, what you can do is pop online and download a commitment form. So that's basically a letter that's signed by your company saying we're committing to set a science-based target. That then goes up on the Science-Based Targets website, acknowledging that you've committed to align to this climate science, and you then have 2 years to actually set that target. So it gives you a bit of leeway there and some time to work towards that. You don't have to sign that commitment letter, but it does sort of help you down that line, and the Science-Based Targets initiative is more readily available to give you support if you need it through that process. And then you want to scope your target. And basically what that is looking at what's included in your footprint. So what our tool does is it essentially calculates those emissions for you and outlines what needs to be included in that target and your level of ambition. So right now, under the Science-Based Targets initiative, you can set for a 1.5 degree scenario, which is best practice and aligns to the climate science. However, you can also set to a well below 2 degree scenario. And that doesn't align to the climate science, but it's essentially a holdover from previous climate science. And the premise there is that if your company is not quite ready to go to that 1.5 degree stage, you can set right now to a well below 2 degree scenario, which is essentially just a bit less ambitious, and work towards setting that 1.5 degree scenario. So it'd be essentially the understanding that you are going to set to a 1.5 degree scenario at some point in the future. And then you want to calculate your target. So our tool does that for you. If you weren't using the tool, there are resources available on the Sciencebased Targets website. What ours does is it makes that biogenic carbon conversation very easily because it does it for you. So what we were talking about before, where if you're purchasing wood and you're then using that wood as a fuel stock, it then accounts for those emissions there. So you don't have to worry about any of those calculations specifically, what might be counted or included or excluded within science-based targets. And just on that, I should mention that you can't account for the entirety of the biogenic emissions in the logs that you purchase. So for example, if you're not burning those, but rather you're selling it on to the client, to a consumer, that then isn't allowed to be included. Rather, that is counted as a portion of your emissions in terms of the embodied carbon associated with that. But it's not a sort of offset taking off of the entirety of your carbon emissions. And then the last step is once you have that target, once you know what it is to basically submit to the Science-Based Targets Initiative and have that target validated, and then you can communicate that target officially to your stakeholders. And the Science-Based Targets Initiative will also help you with some of that marketing and communications around that. There are two processes to go through, and it's dependent on what your company looks like. So there's a small, medium-sized enterprise as well as a, I guess, other company approach. Our tool is specific to the entirety of a company, so not a small, medium-sized enterprise approach, but you could definitely use the tool to help you submit to that SME approach. So this is an example output from the tool about what a science-based target or climate science aligned target looks like. So on the far left, we have a company's 2018 emissions. This is just example data, so don't read too much into this. But essentially they're looking at just under 5,000 tons, and they're setting a target for 2030. And what that means is it's a reduction from that 5,000 tons down to just over 2,000 tons. We also, from the straight line and the dotted line, that's communicated in an intensity metric. So you can have an absolute target, which is essentially that 30 to 50% off the entirety of your emissions, or it could be communicated in terms of a unit of measure. So specifically when we're looking at wood product manufacturing, that's likely to be cubic meters of throughput. And so that's what we're seeing on the secondary axis on the right there. And so you can set targets to specifically look at just that intensity metric, or you can look at both absolute and intensity as well.
Is it true that I see that companies report on both in some instances, both absolute targets and intensity targets?
Yep, so you can set for both. And if you go down that intensity route, your target does need to be based off of an absolute metric. We do recommend setting both because essentially what that intensity metric allows you to do is, regardless of growth, you can have a better understanding of your standpoint and essentially carbon intensity. So, you know, examples from other industries, we see Coca-Cola saying we're going to reduce 50% of emissions per drink in hand. So it's something that's very easily communicated across the industry. So for example, within wood product manufacturing, somebody might not understand what a 30% reduction is off of your 2018 emissions, but they'll definitely understand it off of throughput, as everybody might be working within that sector would be working off of that same intensity metric. So the last step, once you've calculated your carbon emissions and have then set a target, is to engage your stakeholders. And this is really important, and we have talked about this a bit throughout, and we'll continue to talk about it in the webinar towards the end as well. But essentially that's your employees. So how do you ensure that everybody working across your business understands what these targets are, understand what it means for them and for their position? So you want engagement across the whole, so that basically they can go home and talk about what they're doing and how they're contributing to this, and you can basically have that buy-in and better support for it. Engagement across investors and customers, consumers, and general public. So in terms of investors, that's being transparent and open in terms of what your target is, where you're at in terms of achieving your target, and you're reporting against that on an annual basis. And the same goes for your customers. So ensuring that they understand that you've set this target, what your goals are, why you're doing this, how you're going to get there, and how it impacts or benefits them as well. And so specifically, if you're in an area of the supply chain, as we were talking about earlier when we were talking about those drivers and the value, it's really important that your customers understand that by purchasing your product that is aligned to the climate science, that is working to reduce its embodied carbon, is going to assist them in achieving their carbon reduction or sustainability goals as well. And then last bit is about ensuring that consumers and the general public are also aware of the efforts that you're doing, how it's relevant to them, and what they can be doing on an individual level. So that might be engaging the consumers to understand what they can do at that end of life stage. So is it recapturing that wood that was in their home or however it was used, so that you can start trying to reduce that emissions at that stage as well. So we're just going to go through a couple of case studies about what leadership looks like, and to reiterate some of those key principles of climate action leadership, we're looking at international alignment. So that's aligning to Science-Based Targets Initiative or the international best practice climate science that we're seeing, that 1.5 degree scenario, or the sustainable development goals, I should say. And that is really important because this is a global issue that we want to be working on together, and we want to see movement across all industry across the globe. So it's important to make sure that not only are you reporting and sort of following against Australian standards, but are also working towards that international alignment as well. Then we have being holistic. So this goes back to the premise around not only setting targets across your scope 1 and 2 emissions, but also ensuring that you're including those scope 3 emissions as well, because that's where we're seeing the bulk of emissions. And there's often difficulty in terms of direct action in terms of what you can do to reduce in your supply chain. But that's when you go back to how you're engaging your stakeholders, how you're trying to actually make those meaningful reductions. And we'll talk about a few case studies that talk about that engagement as well. Being transparent. So for your investors, for consumers, you want to make sure that you are providing clear, transparent climate strategy and annual reporting so they can understand your position and where you're going and how far you are in terms of achieving that. Engage employees, customers, investors, we've talked about that, and integrating climate action. So that's not only just having this strategy, but ensuring that through the business, all levels of the business, that climate action is understood and everybody's working towards that. So that's board level oversight, things like remuneration linked to carbon reduction, employee programs so that they understand what their contribution can be and how they can help you get towards that goal as well. So just jumping into case studies. So Stora Enso was the first company in the sector across the globe to have an official science-based target. So they are a Finnish pulp and paper manufacturer, and they set their science-based target in 2017. So what they have done that I think is particularly unique is their commitment across scope 3. And what they've done there is they've committed to engaging 70% of its suppliers and downstream logistic partners to set their own science-based targets. So this is a mechanism that can be used within science-based targets rather than saying they're going to reduce their supply chain emissions 70%. They're instead targeting those companies and those suppliers to actively get them to commit to also setting a science-based target and aligning to that 1.5 degree trajectory. So that is really going to impact their own supply chain and the bulk of their emissions, as we saw before, that are the hot spot within that scope 3. We also have Mondi, which is a global leader in packaging and paper. And what they've done is they've also set a science-based target. But as we talked about before, they also have alignment more broadly in terms of this climate leadership that we're talking about, in having aligned their climate goals to the Sustainable Development Goals. So specifically, Sustainable Development Goal 13 is climate action. And what we're seeing with Mondi is they've actually pulled that aspect out and they're actively reporting against those climate goals. So not only do they have their science-based targets, but they're expanding that to align to other international agendas as well. Been working with Timberlink to set their science-based targets, and it's very exciting that they have been successful in that. James, I guess I'll just hand over to you in case there's anything specifically you want to say, tell the audience about your experience.
Look, from a Timberlink point of view, we clearly embarked on this as a cornerstone to our strategy from a sustainability point of view. We were certainly supported by New Forest in regard to embarking on this. And for us, whilst it wasn't a market-driven initiative demanded by our customers, we certainly saw it as a point of difference and something more broadly in our organisation around, leading from a employee perspective, the footprint that we leave for our children. So for us, this was very much a culture-driven program that obviously gave us the opportunity to look more broadly at how we're impacting both the environment and what our long-term goals are. Obviously, we continue to look at particularly our Scope 3. Our Scope 3 is more challenging because of the pure nature of where some of our residue products go. But equally, further renewable energy programs we're working on, hydrogen fuel opportunities, and then further utilisation, particularly around vehicles, which is another area that we have a high exposure to. So for us, it's been an interesting journey. It's certainly been enlightening, and certainly the work that each have done for us and worked with us on has presented us with some really audacious goals as we move forward.
Great, thanks, James. Just going to take a minute or two to see if anybody has any specific questions for you, and they can just pop it into the question and answer box.
Do you want to talk about Maisie, carbon offsets? Whether that seems like an obvious way to reduce your emissions. So how does that work with the science-based targets methodology?
Yeah, that's a great question. So offsets are not allowed in the science-based targets commitment. So essentially, if you make that science-based target commitment, you can't use offsets to achieve your target. We do have a lot of clients that, for example, set a science-based target and then they use the sort of remainder of emissions to then offset to achieve a sort of net zero standpoint from their business. But if, for example, your target, like Timberlink's, is a 21% reduction across Scope 1, 2, and 3 of throughput, that 21% reduction cannot be achieved through offsets. Rather, you need to find other tangible carbon reduction measures within your operations and supply chain in order to achieve that reduction. So yeah, great question.
Another question, which thanks Chris for raising this, is around the difference between sourcing replanted for timber, for example. So the difference between native logging and using perhaps certified or at least replanted timber. Would that make a difference in terms of the Scope 3 emissions from the logs? How is that dealt with on an organizational level, which we're looking at here?
I might actually just see if my colleague Joana wants to respond to that one.
In this instance, we followed the logic that was used in the Australian Timber Environmental Product Declaration. The only carbon flow that was actually accounted for was whatever was sequestered in the logs. So in terms of the net loss of a carbon stock in an area of land or associated with a stand, because there's been an irreversible loss of carbon due to unsustainable logging, it doesn't really get taken into account. In this case, it didn't get reflected. It
is a very interesting topic because the biogenic carbon and the Scope 3, it's converging towards a consensus, but there are certainly different methodologies out there, and it's the part of the purpose of this project as well to bring that together to give some certainty on how to account for these emissions in different scenarios, and setting the precedence with Timberlink to show that this if you follow this methodology, it will be approved with a high probability by the Sciencebased Target Initiative. Because some of these topics, there's a lot of different curveballs associated with calculating the carbon footprint in different scenarios.
Yeah. And Jonas, we have another question that's come in. What approach can be taken by companies which are not vertically integrated to address Scope 3 emissions? Any comments on that?
That's a good question. The Scope 3 emissions is you have to look at it, I suppose, from a different mindset than finding reductions within your own operation. And if you are dealing with suppliers where you might have a limited, for example, purchasing power or leverage, it poses challenges. And it's almost always comes up as a difficulty that I can't really influence upstream or downstream very much. My leverage is core. For companies that does have less of a control, we often see the aggregated action that they take. Going to another industry where we work with science-based targets with a telecom company. So Optus, for example, was one of the first companies to set science-based targets in the region here. And they were looking at the mobile phones and tablets. That was a huge part of their emissions, the majority of their Scope 3 emissions. But then they, how can we possibly influence Samsung and Apple being such a small purchaser of their products? And the way they tackled that was to join initiatives like the SBT or other telecom initiatives where they could aggregate and approach those companies from a common front. I suppose that's the power of the science-based target as well, that you can get that rallying of support where everyone talks the same language and everyone's addressing the issues and emissions in a consistent way. So I'm not sure if that answers the question specifically, but Scope 3 is a bit of a challenge and requires a different perspective to address.
Yeah. I might just go back to our slides, finish that off, and then use the last couple of minutes to go back to questions. So thanks, James, for your comments on Timberlink's specific experience. And I'll just hand over to you, Jonas, to talk about where you can find out more information.
Find more information. There's lots of resources out there. I'll talk to a few of those. For example, the building product information rating is a platform for the construction industry specifically, where you can go and find low carbon products, but also identify suppliers and organizations with carbon target and science-based targets set. Green Star has addressed embodied emissions and carbon for a while, but there's a new tool coming out hopefully this month, which will step that up even further and provide requirements and guidance on how to reduce embodied carbon emissions and life cycle carbon emissions in buildings. We have the EPD program, where you can find a broad range of products with comprehensive environmental information. The Forest and Wood Product Association and Wood Solutions were one of the first ones in Australia to publish industry-wide environmental product declarations of their products. And they've been recently updated. It's a great resource to go in and find comprehensive information, consistent information from a broad range of sources. We have the World Green Building Council, which put out a interesting paper last year around bringing embodied carbon up front. And that's really an international call for action and brings together a lot of best practice and good case studies in terms of how to reduce emissions again in the built environment. Science-Based Target Initiative has been around for quite a while now. I think it's 5 years, and they developed a great wealth and breadth of resources. If you jump on their website, and you can also find all these 1,000 companies that are listed, and about half of those you can have set targets that you can review and look at. Also a little bit of a plug for the Edge Environment Science-Based Targets e-learning. It's a free resource. It was developed on the back of this project with NIFPI, and if you go to that link, you can essentially do a 20-minute training program. It's open access, it's free, it's been proven to be quite popular and appreciated. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the standards for how to account are also free resources that's been well established and developed over many years, and we got the links there. And then you have the Wood Solutions, the ultimate renewable resource, where there's a broad range of timber-specific information, wood-specific information. And I believe from that website you can also straight access the environmental product declarations that's been developed for the industry-wide Australian timber industry, categorized in a a range of different product categories.
Thanks, Jonas. That's all we have time for today. Actually, we've come up right on 9:30. We do have our email addresses here, so feel free to shoot us an email if you have any additional questions that we didn't have time for today. As I said, this will be put up on the NIFPI website, a recording of this webinar, as well as our final tool and resources. So do reach out to them to specifically find that web address. And as I said, we will be previewing the tool next week on Friday, same time. So join us for that webinar if you would like to learn more about the tools that we've developed. Otherwise, yes, do get in touch if you have any questions, and have a great rest of your Friday. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thank you.